This kind of thing is never supposed to happen, at least not in this country, and certainly not in this day and age. Organ donations are supposed to be safe and regulated, and mistakes like this are not normal. At least, I hope not. I'm old enough to remember a time in my small town when we didn't even have a hospital. And now our little burg has a full clinic and even a couple surgeons. It used to be that if you stepped on a rusty nail, or your uncle had an accident in the mines, or your meemaw fell off her porch, you'd ring up a friend, and they'd drive you over to Ivy, or Haverton, or wherever they'd built the newest and nearest hospital. And you'd hope you didn't die on the way there. Sickness is different, though. When your small town's entire economy survived off of the slowly declining output of one of the oldest iron mines in the state, you tend to have a lot of men getting sick. And it's not always something they can just drive you over to the next town to fix. Silicosis, heavy metal poisoning, and lung cancer are our neighbors here. Each their own grim reaper we all expect to come knocking at some point. I was just a kid when I was diagnosed. My parents called it my ailment, but Dr. Hill at Ivy Presbyterian called it restrictive cardiomyopathy. The muscles of my heart were too stiff, likely caused by hemochromatosis. Too much iron in my blood. All things considered, though, it didn't hold me back too bad. Sure, I never fulfilled my dad's dream of going to play for Tennessee State, but I still earned my degree. And sure, I did have to ask my prom date to slow down a few times so I could catch my breath on the dance floor. But she still eventually agreed to marry me. When I graduated, my wife and I decided to move back home. Things had changed enough in our town that there were more career options than mine worker or general store cashier. I ended up using my degree to manage a small accounting firm not too far from my parents' house. And when my mom passed on back in '96, we inherited my childhood home. I wish I could say my life was just one big happy success story. But that just ain't realistic. Eventually, the mine shut down, and half the town lost their source of income. Businesses closed. Not many people needed accounting managers around here, and suddenly I found myself out of a job too. I took a position managing a local hardware store instead. And while money was tighter than it used to be, Henrietta and I managed to survive. It didn't help that my heart was getting worse. Every passing year, it was a little harder to walk up the stairs to our bedroom. And every year, the doctor's visits became more and more frequent. Martin, honey, I wish you'd consider moving. You could be so much happier at a job in another town. And it'd be so much easier to get you care when you'd need it. Henrietta said to me from behind her coffee one morning. I lowered my magazine and looked at her. It wasn't the first time we'd had this conversation. I had to admit Shed made many compelling appeals, but this was our home. Everyone and everything we know is here, Hen, I sighed. Because they're stuck here, Martin. They have mortgages to pay off, and kids that need feeding, and jobs that they're happy with. We don't have any of those things. We're free to go, to build the life you'd planned for. It wasn't the first time Shed said something to that point, but every time I heard it, it softened my stiff heart just a little to the idea. Well, see, next year, maybe. It was 5 years later, in that same home, that my wife passed on. Blood, cancer. Sometimes, a place can take everything you have and find a way to take more. It was about a year ago when I de-resigned myself to let my body give up on me, to let my weak heart strangle me whenever it saw fit. A transplant was nearly out of the question. My folks had both come from out of state, and there weren't many people dying nearby with a negative blood. I decided to skip my yearly checkup, and Dr. Hill, who'd semi-retired to my hometown but still helped out when needed, personally called me up at my job to ask me to reconsider. Had overseen my condition since I was a boy, and we'd grown to be friends as we'd aged. Martin, if you don't come in, I can't guarantee you have long left. Your heart is manageable, but you need medication and care. What if that's not what I want anymore, Pete? What if I'm ready to go? I'll admit, it had been a dark time in my life, and I was ready. I missed my wife, and I hoped she'd be waiting for me. Martin, that's not what Henrietta would want. You know that as well as I do. His words stung. He was absolutely right, too. But of course, I wasn't ready to hear it. I hung up and went back to work. People weren't going to cut their own plywood. It wasn't until about 6 months ago that a miracle happened. At least a miracle for me. I received a phone call at 2:39 a.m. on July the 5th. ID only just managed to fall asleep after a night of watching. The neighbors' kids try their best to light fireworks in the pouring rain. I groggily answered the phone. Dr. Hill's voice greeted me, simultaneously somber and excited, as though he were ashamed to be happy about something. Martin, we've got some news. There was an accident in town. Some biker from out of state. He was passing through tonight, and the rain. He's brain dead. Martin, but his heart had be a match for you. I had my boots on by the time he said the man was brain dead. The town clinic was small. Not quite just a doctor's office anymore, but a far cry from a complete hospital. Still, though, they had a morgue and a surgery room, usually for tonsil removals or appendectomies. Dr. Hill greeted me at the front door and took my umbrella. He explained to me that they couldn't keep the heart viable for long, and there was no way to get a helicopter in through this storm to take us to a more well-equipped facility, so the surgery would have to be tonight. Here, I asked him if I could thank the man who'd be giving me a second chance. He explained again that the man was brain dead, but it was more a symbolic gesture, for me anyways. He took me to the room where the man's empty body laid. He was a muscular man, maybe in his late 50s or so, lanky. Long graying auburn hair hung from his head, partially caked in drying blood. His dark complexion, tanned from years of exposure to the elements, was paling and quickly yellowing seemingly before my very eyes. Breathing tubes and an oxygen mask obscured the man's face, but I could make out long, braided beard. The man was covered in tattoos. Torn and bloodied skin hid detail from me, but the dark and faded markings on his skin wove a tapestry of artwork. None of the symbols or designs recognizable to me. There was only one single tattoo that remained unobscured and undamaged, located squarely on his right forearm. It was striking a spiraling serpent, devouring its own tail. Ouroboros, I think it's called. His body was mangled. Broken limbs that at this point weren't worth casting. Bleeding wounds that had been haphazardly wrapped, just to keep the hospital bed clean. It was saddening to look at. A man, still technically alive, but given up on. For my sake, his name is Marcus Rain. Dr. Hill startled me with his interjection. Hayes, from Dallas. I called his emergency contact, apparently his wife or ex-wife or something. She says he left home about 6 months ago. Hasn't been himself in a while. Not many people left to miss him anymore. Damn shame. 2, he was donated a kidney last year and barely got a chance to try it out. Dr. Hill chuckled until I cut him a disapproving look. He recomposed himself for a moment. He must have been moved by the gesture. Registered himself as an organ donor a week after his operation. Pass it on. That kind of thing. I softly placed my weathered hand over Marcus for a moment and whispered a silent thank you as Dr. Hill began to prepare for surgery. I woke up the following evening. There was no ICU at the clinic, so Dr. Hill had called up a few colleagues to come and help ensure my post-operation went smoothly. They gradually eased me off of my medications, and within a few days, Dr. Hill was driving me back home. Now you remember to stop taking your old medication. It'll interfere with the success of the transplant, he chided, and take it easy for as long as you can. Let Damien or one of the other clerks saw the 2x4s at the shop, and absolutely no heavy lifting. Marcus' heart was healthy, but there was some minor scarring. That could be an issue if you don't let it rest for at least a few months. I reassured Dr. Hill that I'd take good care of myself, but secretly, I was only excited to have a second chance at a normal life. I could eventually start exercising again. I could travel. I might even pick up hiking. Dr. Hill dropped me off at home, but not before once again warning me about the symptoms I could expect in the weeks post: fever, fatigue, chest pain, all supposed to be completely normal. I reminded him that those were things I had lived with my entire life, and thanked him again before he helped me wheel inside. It was only a week or so before I was comfortable enough to stand again. And not too long after that I held a barbecue to celebrate my recovery. I invited the whole neighborhood, and of course the entire local medical team, who had performed such a miraculous surgery. I bought a new grill from my store, and spent the entire weekend doing yard work and preparing my home for guests. Dr. Hill was one of the last to arrive, and sternly discouraged me from doing any more manual labor, and reminded me that I wasn't even supposed to be eating red meat because of my blood pressure. As I served him his plate, I shrugged him off and told him that I felt completely fine, and that I just felt like eating steak. It was about a month post-operation that the complications first began. I had indeed started hiking, as ID planned to, and I had never felt more refreshed, until one afternoon. I had hardly begun my first uphill stretch, when I felt a sharp pain in my chest. It wasn't the typical dull tightness I'd been used to all my life, but a stinging jab that overcame me for just a moment before subsiding. I called Dr. Hill once again, and he begrudgingly reminded me that he was technically retired, and that if I was going to continue to ignore his medical advice anyways, I should call up the local clinic instead. That stung a bit, but once again, it's not as though he were wrong. I checked myself into our town's clinic, and a young doctor greeted me and sat me down for my appointment. I explained to her my recent chest pain and the advice that Dr. Hill had given me, and she patiently explained to me that chest pain was entirely normal even as far out as months after the transplant. She urged me to listen to the advice I was being given and take as much time as I could to relax. How could I begin to explain to her that ID had to relax my entire life? And I finally felt like I had the energy to live. I thanked her, begrudgingly paid my copay for the visit, and set off towards home. It was less than a week before the urge to be more active again finally overcame my will, and I began to hike again. The chest pain returned every few days, never lasting more than a few seconds or a minute at most. I was completely fine with momentary discomfort. After all, I still had breath in my lungs and energy to spare. This new heart was just settling in, I told myself. After all, it was supplying a whole new body with a lifetime of energy that had been stolen from it. It was 2 months post-operation that the varicose veins appeared. I'm not exactly a spring chicken, but I didn't think it was normal for those to appear quite so soon, or so suddenly. I decided that it would be best if I avoided the doctor entirely for this one. I pulled out my old work laptop and booted up my internet connection and Googled something for the first time, since my wife's doctor told us she had my search results indicated about what ID expected. Varicose veins can appear due to stress, aging, and high blood pressure. That had to be it. My new heart beat with a vitality and strength that my circulatory system just needed time to adjust to. I excitedly laced up my hiking boots and left on my next trip up the mountain. I remember making it just past the out-jutted rock you could see from my backyard when I must have blacked out. I woke up in a hospital that I didn't recognize, surrounded by doctors I didn't know, and hooked up to equipment I had never seen before. They explained to me that ID collapsed on the hiking trail and had been found a few hours later by a local jogger who had gotten me help. I had been moved to a hospital in a larger city a couple hours away, as it was determined that the local clinic was unable to properly assess me. I was badly sunburnt and very dehydrated, but what concerned the doctors the most were my scan results. They showed me a few graphs, some charts, and finally my scan images, and I had a hard time making out what I was seeing. The doctors explained to me that what had initially been interpreted as scar tissue by Dr. Hill on my new heart was in fact an aggressive form of cancer. They guessed a cancer of the blood vessels that had apparently gone undiagnosed in Marcus before his death. It had metastasized in me and begun to spread through my circulatory system. The doctors explained to me that my chest pains and my varicose veins were all early warning signs that could have been detected if I had been taken to a competent facility sooner. They gave me about 5 months to live and sent me on my way. Dr. Hill seemed a little overly smug as he picked me up from the hospital. "You know, I used to work here. It's where I first diagnosed your heart issue when you were a boy." I shrugged, not enthused to endure his "I told you so" old man smugness on the 2-hour drive home. Jesus, Martin, why is it so hard for you to listen to me? You've never been like this. You should never have started hiking. You shouldn't have gone back to work so soon. And you certainly shouldn't be eating so much red meat. The doctors in there told me that as they were wheeling you in, you vomited a half-pound of pork sausage. What the hell has gotten into you? Who was he to scold me like that? He may be 20 years my senior, but he sure as hell wasn't my father or my minister. Hell, he wasn't even my doctor anymore. I spat back at him. If I hadn't gone hiking in the first place, they probably never would have found the cancer that you missed. The cancer that you put into my body, Peter. The car ride was crushingly silent on the way home. My anger towards him bubbled inside, and I silently enjoyed the sensation of my blood boiling. An emotional luxury my old heart never could have afforded. I felt a hotter anger than I had ever experienced before. He dropped me off at home and snidely said to me as I exited the car, "If I hear you keep acting like this, I want to be there next time to pick you back up." I was going to ignore it, and I began to walk back inside, when I heard something, a small, quiet voice in the back of my head. "No one gets to talk to me like that." I was only taken aback by this sudden inner monologue for a moment before I instinctively agreed with it. I turned around and ran back to Dr. Hill's car. He was starting to drive away when I reached it, and I furiously banged on his window. He stopped his car, rolled the window down, and looked at me like I was insane while he began to ask me what the hell I was doing. I swiftly interrupted him. "Who the hell do you think you are, Peter? No one gets to talk to me like that. No one. Especially a washed-up retired surgeon who can't even identify a tumor growing on a heart when he sees it. He'll keep doing whatever the hell I want with the rest of my life, especially as short as it's going to be. To be honest, Pete, I haven't needed you in a long time, so don't count on me ever needing you again." I took a second to steady myself. My body froze in response to the gust of fury that had unexpectedly left me long enough for him to notice that my burst of anger only thinly masked the fear I felt. "You're not yourself, Martin," he said to me. "Get inside and clean yourself up, for God's sake. You look homeless. Henrietta would be ashamed if she could see you now." Peter Hill drove off without another word, and it was the last time him and I ever spoke to each other. I stared at my gravel driveway, unable to move since my tirade. I couldn't believe what I'd done. In one fell swoop, ID personally guaranteed that the one remaining friend had was out of my life for my final months. When I finally found the courage to regain my composure, I trudged towards my house. For the first time in a while, it loomed over me like a disappointing parent, and I felt weak and shameful, like I had in my youth. I took a look at myself in the mirror that night, a long and hard look. The doctors explained that I had been badly sunburnt, but now I could see it for myself. My skin appeared dark and leathery, as though I'd been outside for weeks. Peter was right. I had let my once clean-shaven face become scruffy and unkempt. The hairs that had begun to sprout from my face were unkempt and bristly, unlike the neat and thin hair Elle had been accustomed to shaving daily. The varicose veins sprawled under my skin, ever darker and blacker than when I had left for my hike early that morning. They had started to extend further to now twisting and spiraling across my arms, culminating in clusters that washed my skin with mottled darkness. It wasn't until I looked at my right arm that I noticed a group of them clumped together in an unnatural shape, darker and neater than the rest of my veins, distinctly circular and neatly positioned below my wrist. The image of an Ouroboros tattoo marked on a dead man flashed. In my mind, before I put the ridiculousness of the notion aside, I shaved my face, took a much-needed shower, and applied some aloe cream to my burnt skin, then drifted off into a restless sleep. I was awoken the next morning to a chest pain far sharper than any ID previously encountered. I staggered out of bed, my chest pulsing and sweat dripping from my forehead. This certainly wasn't normal. The cancer must be becoming more rapid, the spread more aggressive. I trudged to the restroom and found to my discouragement that the veins had grown darker and more distinct around my body, the circular cluster on my arm ever more resembling a tattoo. I filled a glass with tap water and began to take the variety of prescriptions that the doctors at Ivy Presbyterian had given to me. As I raised my hand to swallow the pills, a gruff voice once again whispered to me in my head, my own inner monologue given a tangible voice to hear. Don't take those. You'll kill me. I stopped for a moment and looked at the pills in my hand. The doctors knew I was going to die anyways. Why should I trust that these pills were going to help me in the slightest? Of course they wouldn't. All they'd do is slow the cancer and prolong my suffering. I tossed the pills in the toilet and began to get dressed for my day. The pain in my chest had begun to subside as I pulled into the parking lot of the hardware store. And as I stepped out of my pickup, a cool breeze shot through my hair, and a nostalgic feeling shot through my blood like an icy warmth. As I began my shift, the teenagers who worked for me were flirting behind the counter, stocking the vending machine, or assisting the early riser customers. Each and every one of them stopped to stare at me as I entered. I knew that I had begun to look worse for wear. But when the acne-ridden kids with nose rings and green hair are looking at you like you're the oddball, you start to get the feeling enough is enough. I barked at them to get back to work, and they hastily turned to resume their duties. It was rare I lost my temper with them, and they knew to listen. My shift trudged on ever slower. My chest felt tight throughout the day, sore and aching as the veins around my body twisted and mottled my skin. I left work early to go home and get some rest, but I knew that sleep would not find me easily. By the time I finally made it home, I could feel the foreign heart in my chest pounding against my ribcage. I couldn't help feeling like Marcus' heart was pumping cancer throughout my body with all the effort it could muster. The image of a moldy sponge being squeezed into a bucket came into my mind. As my head became woozy, I hastily undressed, and as I flung off my jeans, my wallet fell out of my pocket. Poking out the top of it was a pristine organ donor card I didn't remember putting in there. The terrible writhing working its way through my body compelled me to put off investigating it until the morning, and I made my way to my room. I collapsed into bed in a cold sweat, and the small nagging voice in my head whispered to me once more, "Sleep, Martin, will be all right in the morning." For the next 3 months, my body became a stranger to me. The dark veins that had first appeared as faint, wriggling streaks now sprawled across my skin in intricate, angular patterns. They didn't just grow, they etched themselves deep and deliberate into shapes that seemed almost purposeful. My arm bore the clearest marker, perfect Ouroboros, coiled and unbroken. The black veins so thick they rose under my skin like cords, straining against a taut surface. My skin had toughened, as though it had been stretched too far and then left out to dry. It wasn't just leather, it was unnatural. It didn't even feel like skin anymore. The changes didn't stop. My beard, once sparse and graying, grew back wild and rough, its deep auburn hues swallowing the gray. My hairline, long receded, seemed to march forward, strands of that same unfamiliar auburn forcing their way through the silk. I stopped looking in the mirror altogether. It only made me feel more alien in my own skin. And then came the growing pains. It began with an ache, sharp and deep, shooting through my arms and legs in the middle of the night. I thought it might be my joints or some side effect of my failing body. But then I noticed my clothes shirts pulling tight across my chest, my jeans creeping higher up my ankles. At first, I told myself it was swelling or water retention. or literally anything but the obvious truth. By the time I finally measured myself, I had grown nearly 3 inches taller. My limbs stretched as though my bones were being pulled apart, slowly. Deliberately, my joints ached constantly, my body struggling to keep up with the unrelenting rhythm of a heart that wasn't mine. My spine hunched, vertebrae protruding far further from my back than they should, but nothing compared to the pain in my chest. It was more than pressure or tightness, it was movement. I could feel it, something burrowing deeper into me, snaking through my organs, wrapping around my ribs, anchoring itself to my bones. The pain would come in waves, sharp and searing, leaving me gasping for breath. One night, it was so bad it woke me from a dreamless sleep. I stumbled out of bed, clutching my chest, and caught sight of myself in the mirror. My ribs were heaving, my skin stretched so tight I could see the faint ripple of movement beneath it. My hand flew to my chest. For a horrifying moment, I swore I felt its heart, shifting, repositioning itself, like a living thing searching for a better grip. I doubled over, gagging, and in the midst of the pain, I heard the voice again. Relax. Let it happen. It was louder now, more distinct. Not just a whisper in the back of my mind, but something tangible. Something there. It wasn't my voice, and it sure as hell wasn't mine to control. The impossible, terrible idea that it was Marcus growing inside of me had gnawed at my mind for a while. Every day, the thought became harder and harder to push back, and instead, it slowly became accepted as an absolute truth. Somehow, someway, he was still alive in me. The idea haunted me, gnawing at me during every quiet moment I had. It wasn't just the voice at low, gravelly whisper that urged me to give in to my darker instincts, but the sensations, the impulses, little things at first, easy to dismiss. Then, there were the memories. Flashes of images that didn't belong to Medisart skies stretching into infinity. The sting of wind against my face. I saw flashes of burning forests, endless rows of trees that seemed to writhe in the flame. One night, I caught myself humming a tune I didn't recognize. Some twangy country dirge that felt as foreign as the veins twisting under my skin. How much of me was still me? How much had been overwritten? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the stress or medication. Maybe it was my own body trying to adapt to the transplant. My brain cobbling together fragments of identity to make sense of the changes. But the more I tried to explain it, the less it made sense. The voice grew louder when I resisted. I'd reach for my pills, and it would hiss at me, sharp and insistent. Don't take those. They'll kill me, not you. It wasn't just the voice, either. My body resisted. The pills felt foreign in my hand, their edges sharp against my palm. My throat tightened when I tried to swallow them, as though I were choking on something too large. When I finally forced them down, I felt sick for osmosis and weak, washed with shame as though I'd done something wrong. And yet, when I skipped a dose, my strength returned. My legs felt steady, my pulse strong. I'd look in the mirror and see the changes muscles I hadn't ever had. A flush of sickening rosy color in my cheeks. But it wasn't my strength. It wasn't my color. Let it happen. The voice would whisper in those rare moments. I let my gaze linger on the mirror. It's who you are now. Was it? Was this who I was? Or was I just becoming someone else? I started avoiding people. The teenagers at the hardware store had begun to look at me differently, their conversations faltering when I entered the room. I caught Mrs. Delaney, my neighbor of 30 years, staring at me through her kitchen window, her face pale and drawn. I hadn't said a word to her, but she flinched when our eyes met. Dr. Hill had noticed it before anyone else had. That last time we spoke, when he drove me home from the hospital, he looked at me with a strange mix of pity and fear. You're not yourself, Martin, he had said, and he was right. I was losing pieces of myself. Little by little, every day. The way I walked, the way I talked, the way I thought it was all shifting, tilting towards something I didn't recognize. I wanted to fight it. I wanted to believe I could stop it, but every time I tried, The voice was there, whispering, coaxing, reminding me of the truth I didn't want to face. Whatever was growing inside me wasn't a foreign body. It was part of me. I needed answers. Last month, desperate for anything to make sense, I hired a private investigator to dig into Marcus's life. His online presence was sparse, and the few photos I managed to find of him didn't match the man ID seen on the hospital bed. Still, I scraped together what I could and sent it off, along with a chunk of my savings. 2 weeks later, the investigator sent me a file. Marcus Rain wasn't a longtime biker. He wasn't a gang member. He wasn't any of the things ID assumed from his appearance. That night at the clinic, he was a quiet man, a pencil pusher at an insurance company. A family man. He had been in the late stages of kidney failure. When a donor miraculously appeared, an abnegative match, the donor had been found washed up by a nearby river, nearly drowned and brain dead, with an organ donor card in his wallet. The transplant was immediate, routine, the file said, unremarkable. But what followed wasn't. The investigator's notes were sparse, but damning. Marcus' wife claimed he started changing. After the surgery, small things at first. New habits, new preferences, a new temper. He began making reckless decisions, abandoning the quiet stability of his life. A minivan traded for a motorcycle. Tattoos that seemed to appear overnight. And then the violence. By the time his wife filed a restraining order, Marcus was unrecognizable just in his actions, but in his appearance. The file included photos of his tattoos. They were detailed, angular, almost artistic in their precision, but upon closer inspection, I was mistaken. They weren't tattoos at all. They were dark, mottled veins that rooted themselves under his skin, and they matched the ones now growing on my own skin. Vein by vein, line by line, I stared at the photos for hours, trying to make sense of it, trying to feel something that wasn't dread. There is something growing inside me, and it isn't Marcus. I've stopped fighting ITI, don't think I can anymore. My body isn't mine, my reflection isn't mine. Even my thoughts feel foreign. Day by day, I can feel it spreading. My skin stretches to keep up with the changes. My muscles twist to accommodate my growing frame. Beneath my hair, thick and auburn, I feel bony bumps forming, hard and sharp, pushing against my skull. If anyone finds my body, please. I do not give consent for my organs to be donated. I keep taking the stupid card out of my wallet, but whenever I leave home, a new one appears in my pocket anyway. Putting this online seems to be the only way to get this warning out as quickly as possible. The devil is growing in me. I know it. I've never been afraid to die. It's always been on the horizon for me, and I know it'll be with my Henrietta. I just hope she still recognizes me.